Delighted to welcome you this evening to the Holy Cross Genocide Awareness Lecture. My name is Chuck Anderton, and I'm Professor of Economics here at the college. The talk this evening is sponsored by the W. Arthur Garrity Senior Professorship in Human Nature, Ethics, and Society, the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture, the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies, and the Economics and Accounting Department. Special thanks go to Tom Landy, Pat Hinchliff, and Danielle Kane of CREC for their support. The talk and the Q&A that follows are being recorded. Tonight we are honored to have Dr. James Waller speak to us about the difficult subject of genocide. I first met Dr. Waller in 2009 during a 3-week research symposium on genocide that he directed. What so many, including myself, find inspiring about Dr. Waller are the depth and breadth of his research, his passion and abilities for developing educational programs and policies to prevent genocide and other mass atrocity crimes, and the generosity he offers to so many people in the genocide studies field and the mass atrocity prevention community. Dr. Waller is an internationally recognized genocide scholar and educator. He is the Cohen Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State College in New Hampshire and the Academic Programs Director for the Auschwitz Institute for Peace and Reconciliation, based in New York City, but with many programs around the world. He is also a curriculum developer for various seminars that introduce military officers and mid-level government officials from around the world to issues of genocide warning and prevention. Dr. Waller has published about 4 articles and chapters and 3 books, including his most well-known work to date, Becoming Evil: How Ordinary People Commit Genocide and Mass Killing. Now, on top of all of this, Jim even played professional minor league baseball for the Hickory Crawdads. And as a northern boy, I'm not really sure what a crawdad even is, but we obviously have more pressing matters to discuss this evening. So without any further delay, please join me in welcoming Dr. James Waller.
Thank you, and can you hear me okay? Good. Thanks for being here tonight. Thanks to Chuck for the kind introduction. It has been the 5 or 6 years I've known Chuck. It's so many things are impressive about him professionally, and it always speaks well of the Cross whenever he's out and about and he meets people from other schools. But my greatest joy in knowing Chuck is he's just one of the best people I know, and it's kind of hard to find people like that. So again, that speaks incredibly well of your school and your institution and just your climate and culture here also. I think I was here 3 or 4 years ago in the same auditorium, so I think Chuck feels that enough time has passed that people forgot whatever that was, and now I can come back and do this. But tonight I want to talk with you a bit. The title of this is the first one the institution's done, Genocide Awareness Lecture. I really didn't give an additional title to it, but I kind of just spent my time thinking about what is it that I'd want people to be aware of about genocide. Some of you come here tonight having already taken courses in it. We have some students here from Clark who are in the graduate program there. Some of you have taken courses here at Holy Cross. So I don't want to miss a good number of people in just assuming that you all know what genocide is and what some of the key issues are. So what I've decided to do is think about it in this way. What are 5 things that I think you need to know, or I wish you to know about genocide? And I'll kind of frame those in 5 questions for our time together tonight. First, why study genocide? Why are you here tonight? Why would anyone even study this topic? Secondly, what is genocide? Thirdly, what are the costs of genocide? Fourthly, where are the current risk areas for genocide around the world today? And then fifthly, and this will be the most important one, what can you do to make a difference in the face of a world that seems intent on still tearing itself apart? So let's talk about those 5 things together. First question, why study genocide? What are some things you would say? You don't have to come to a microphone for this, but why be interested in this topic? Stacy? There's like 150 people here. No one's named Stacy? That's statistically almost impossible. Yes, and back. Okay, a key one, the pragmatic issue. That if we study genocide, maybe we can ensure that something like this would never happen again. Good. What else? What personally could you take from it? I mean, what brings you to it? Yes?
Maybe see the warning signs.
Good, to see the warning signs. And again, that's part of that pragmatic piece. And we'll be talking about that tonight. What are some of the warning signs? Where are the places in the world that we're concerned about? Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has said that we know what the risk factors are for genocide. So we know when the wood is stacked. What we need to understand is, how do we respond once something happens to set that stack of wood ablaze? So that's important. What else personally? What would bring you to this study? Yes?
And you gain knowledge from it.
Okay, it's interesting. You gain knowledge. What type of knowledge do you gain? This will be the last question I ask you, I promise. Yeah?
Like how it happens or why it happens.
Good, so there's some historical knowledge. How it happened, why it happened, where it happened, when it happened, who perpetrated it, who was victimized by it. I lied, I'm going to ask you one more question. But what would you get from it personally? Yes?
I guess kind of like remembering the victims.
Good, remembering the victims, commemorating the loss. You've hit on some of the key things. Let me suggest 3 that I think are kind of, at least for me as I think about this field, important reasons for me to study genocide. One is, my background is training as a social psychologist. So I'm very interested in the spectrum, the psychological spectrum of capacities that we have. And I think genocides are situations of extremity that let us see some of that incredible range of human behavior in situations of extremity. So as you see here, I think there is incredible resilience that we learn about, our capacities for resilience when we study genocide. Let me give you 2 examples just from recent trips. Last April, I had 2 trips, the first to Vancouver, British Columbia on the West Coast. And it was a high school assembly, actually several high schools on Vancouver Island, so about 400 or 500 high school students. I was one of the speakers. There was also a survivor of the Holocaust, a child survivor by the name of Janos. Janos spoke, I spoke, then we shared a table for questions and answers on the stage. And the students, you kind of get this sense, it's high school students, they've heard these horrible stories of suffering. Janos told his story as a Hungarian Jew who was a child survivor of the Holocaust, how much he lost, what he went through, how he found his way to Vancouver, how every day he remembers the loss. So they're trying to make sense of it. How do you make sense of someone who suffered so much? So the first question came from a young woman who was courageous, and she came up to the microphone and she asked a question of Janos. She said, "What was your favorite childhood memory?" And you understand the question. She just wants to hear something good from this. And Janos, who's a large man, he's a former boxer, he was sitting by me, and it was probably a 30-second period of silence that felt like 30 minutes. But for 30 seconds, he sat there, he looked down, and he's not prone to dramatics, and he looked up and responded, and he simply said, "I don't have one." That was it. And she sat down. Period of time, we took the next question. But I think of Janos, and I think the resilience of someone who still has to face, 60 years later, he doesn't have a favorite childhood memory. But he made it, he survived, he was resilient, he was there on that stage that day telling his story to high school students so they would learn, they would be aware of what happened. And I just was so struck by his resilience. I think it was the next week, I went to Notre Dame. You've heard of Notre Dame? Yeah, it's just a small Catholic school, Indiana. Went to Notre Dame. They were having a Rwanda commemoration. And it's, when you have Rwandan commemorations, these go for, I think it was like 6 hours, this one. So that was a small part of that commemoration. But I remember one survivor testimony, actually the woman who invited me to come. And she's telling the story of living in Kigali, the capital city of Rwanda. And she hears the Interahamwe, the young militiamen, coming down the streets of her neighborhood, and they're dragging the machete. And she knows what they're there for. She's lost her husband already. It's herself and her 2 children, and she's just frozen with fear. She doesn't know what to do. She's holding her youngest daughter, who at the time was 5 years of age. And her daughter heard the rackets in the street. She heard the machete. She didn't really know what they were coming for. But her daughter looked at her mom and said, "Mommy, if I go out there and sing for them, I bet they'll like that." And the mom turned away to address something with her other child. Her young daughter left her arms, ran out into the street, saw the Interahamwe, began to sing, and was killed, was hacked to death just as she was singing. And I listened to this woman tell her story, and I look at the life she has carved out in South Bend, Indiana, and I look at the ways that she's tried to find meaning in her life after all she lost, and I was just stunned by just the resilience of it. I mean, certainly it's never left her. She's always going to be touched by that trauma. But I think personally, when we study the Holocaust, we see that of all the things we're capable of, one of those things is an incredible amount of resilience. Doesn't always happen, doesn't always happen quickly, doesn't always happen cleanly, but it's there. It's somewhere within us. It's a capacity we have. We also have a capacity for good. We study the Holocaust, we study about those people, honestly, relatively few and far between, who resisted and rescued. But even seeing those rare cases of someone who stands up and makes a difference tells us that we have the potential to do it. It's hard, for sure. It can be costly, for sure, but it's a capacity. Another capacity is our capacity for evil. As Chuck said in the introduction, this is where I spend most of my time. I interview perpetrators of genocide. It started with a ton of archival work with perpetrators of the Holocaust, and over the past decade really, has expanded to face-to-face interviews with perpetrators in prisons and communities in Rwanda, Argentina, and the former Yugoslavia, primarily Serbia, and Guatemala as well. And setting with perpetrators, asking questions of motivation. How did you come to think it was the right thing to do? To hack this person to death, to shoot this person, to beat this person, to rape this woman. How did you come to think that you were doing a morally defensible, justifiable thing? How did you come to see the victim in such a way that you thought this was okay to do? These are instructive questions because it shows us that just as we have a deep well for goodness, that genocides happen because people kill other people in large numbers and over an extended period of time. And understanding what are the forces that kind of shape our behavior in such a way that we become capable of these atrocities is an important part of understanding who we are. And then the fourth piece, I think, is understanding probably the biggest reaction in the face of genocide. It's not the victims, it's not the people who resist and rescue, it's not the perpetrators, but it's the vast majority of the world who stand by and remain indifferent in the face of this type of evil, the silence of bystanders. I think when you come to study the genocide, or you come to study the Holocaust, despite, and beyond really, all the historical knowledge and awareness you pick up, I think these are learnings about who we are, what we're made of, what we're capable of, that I think are fundamental questions to ask. They're human nature questions. What part of human nature allows me to do good? What part allows me to do evil? What part just allows me to sit back and pretend it doesn't exist, just to be indifferent in the face of it? And what part of human nature helps me to be resilient in the face of these tragedies? I think a second thing we can learn, this is a little sensitive, is just the pragmatic avoidance of future replications. This is what we talked about, several of you mentioned just in the opening discussion. You study genocide because you hope this is something that doesn't exist in the future. I mean, I teach, as Chuck said, at Keene State College in New Hampshire. To this point, we're the only we're the only college or university in the country to offer an undergraduate degree in Holocaust and Genocide studies. It would be a great legacy for me if 20 years from now, we don't have to have this major because we're dealing with something that's no longer a problem. I don't think we're on the cusp of that or even close to it, but we do hope we can learn something about how genocides unfold that help us prevent them. And then finally, I think when you study genocide, it allows you to have a transformational influence on your capacity for empathy, your capacity for compassionate action. I mean, this is large part of Holy Cross's history. What the institution has been founded on is these capacities for social justice and empathy and compassionate action. I think when you study genocide, you're pushed in these directions because you recognize you live in a world that hurts. You live in a world that continues to seem to be intent on tearing itself apart. I'll give you one more example from 7 years ago. I was part of a team for the International Commission on Missing Persons. We happened to be in the former Yugoslavia, just outside of Srebrenica, where 8,000 Muslim men and boys were assassinated, victims of genocide at the hands of proxy serb forces in 1995. 2007, and still today, they're still finding mass graves from that particular genocide and other episodes of mass killing in the Yugoslav wars. We were called to a gravesite that 2 boys had been playing soccer on a muddy field. One of them went to kick the ball. With the ball came up a divot of turf. With the divot of turf came a bone. 5 years before this, people wouldn't have thought of calling ICMP because it was an animal bone. But they quickly learned after the war that what the Serbs often did is when they buried a large number of human victims in a grave, they then covered the grave with the remains of animals because they knew that the bones would work their way to the surface one day, and if people saw animal bones, they wouldn't think anything of it and wouldn't dig deeper. But now we know in the former Yugoslavia, you always dig deeper. And at this particular gravesite in Budak, outside of Srebrenica, we dug deeper, and we found a mass grave that held the remains of about 50 Muslim men and boys from the Srebrenica genocide. They were all partial remains because this was a secondary grave, meaning these men and boys had been killed elsewhere, had been buried elsewhere, and the Serbs got afraid that they were too easy to discover, so they dug up the remains with backhoe, they threw it in the back of pickup trucks, and they just scattered the remains at other graves. So we didn't find any complete skeletons, but partial remains of about 50 victims. About 3 days into this exhumation, a Muslim woman came, and she just kneeled by the edge of the grave, and she prayed. She rocked back and forth. She wept. She sobbed. You know, literally someone's heart can't break, but for the first time in my life, I felt like I was listening to someone whose heart was breaking. I didn't have the language skills to really converse with her about what she was experiencing there, but the story came out over a few days that she had lost at Srebrenica a father, a husband, and 2 sons. 3 generations of males she lost at Srebrenica. Her youngest son, who was 12 years old, his remains, parts of his remains, had already been found in 3 other graves throughout the region. And every time she'd get a knock on the door from ICMP saying that another piece of her son had been found in another grave. She was at this grave that day just praying and sobbing that we weren't going to find another piece of her son because she did not think her heart and soul could take it. She couldn't go through again finding another piece of her son here. You go through experiences like that and you realize when you study genocide, you can't help but have something in you transformed to where you feel deeply the suffering of other people. You feel deeply a push for peace and social justice and compassionate action. Here's a quote from a survivor of the Armenian genocide who says this: "We must know each other's stories. We must consider ourselves one constituent element of a symphony." When students come to my courses on genocide and comparative genocide, this is often the quote I start the course with. I say, if you're here for no other reason, this is the best one. You need to know other people's stories because it's part of your story. It's part of our story. Now, not everyone feels that way because a lot of people say, well, it's not really one big story, it's a lot of small stories, and I don't need to worry about other people's stories. But here's an example of kind of this opposite side. Sorry. This comes from Talat. He was one of the 3 young Turks who was a leader, architect of the Armenian Genocide. And during the Armenian Genocide, which we'll talk about more in a few moments, Talat's receiving a letter here from a Jew protesting what the Muslim regime, the Islamic Turkish regime, is doing to Christian Armenians. And here's Talat's response, which I always find incredible. You are a Jew. These people are Christians. The Muslims and the Jews always get along harmoniously. I'm not real sure where Talat was mentally when he's saying that, but the Muslims and Jews have always gotten along harmoniously. What have you to complain of? Why can't you let us do with these Christians as we please? And I love that question Talat embeds in there. What have you to complain of? And I think that reminds us again of the push we need to have for empathy and compassionate action. Are we going to live in a world where someone can say to us, the suffering's not about you, so what have you to complain of? If that's the world we want to construct and live in, we can. It's a pretty horrible world. We certainly never want to be the people on the short end of the suffering with that. But what Talat pushes me here to say is, what have I to complain of? I have something to complain of, because that suffering is also my suffering. That injustice is also an injustice done to me as well. And again, I think when you study genocide, you broaden your horizons in such a way that you realize, what have you to complain of? You have a lot to complain of. Because when someone suffers anywhere, that's suffering that all of us ought to feel to some degree. Second question we want to ask is the question, what is genocide? This can actually take us, I don't know, Chuck said I had 3 hours tonight. This could take us most of the time. Chuck was the only one laughing. But this could take us most of the time if we had a semester. But how do we define genocide? How do we talk about it? Let's talk about it from the standpoint first of a story. And this story is set in the Armenian Genocide, 1915 to 1923. We're coming up in 2015 on the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide. So this coming spring, you'll likely hear both on campus and off campus internationally a lot about the Armenian Genocide. But just very quickly, 1.5 million Christian Armenians, it's estimated, fall prey. They're killed by an Islamic, Turkish, or Ottoman, present-day Turkey regime. One of the survivors of that genocide is a young man, Christian Armenian, by the name of Soghomon Tehlirian. Soghomon Tehlirian's house and family is attacked by the Turks. He watches his father and mother killed. He sees his father beheaded. He sees a brother killed in front of his own eyes. He sees a sister raped and then killed. And then they attack Tehlirian. They attack Soghomon. The perpetrators leave him in his house under the mound of bodies of his family members because they're sure he's dead. He wasn't dead. He survived, had his wounds treated. He fled outside of Armenia, and then he joined a group of basically extrajudicial assassination squad to bring to justice the architects, the leaders of the Turkish regime that led to the destruction of so much life in the Armenian Genocide. Tehlirian is tasked with tracking down Mehmet Talat, one of the architects of the genocide, and he does so in Berlin. March 1921, Talat is walking with his wife through a beautiful park by the Castle Charlottenburg. It's actually just across from where I lived for 2 years when I taught in Berlin. Tehlirian jumps out from behind a bush. He shoots both Talat and his wife. He wounds Talat's wife, and he kills Talat. And he's put on trial. He doesn't try to flee or escape. He says, this is for the loss of my family. This is to avenge my family. Talat dies. and Sogomon-Tellurian's put on trial. It's the international trial of its time. Whatever famous trials you think of now, this was the big one for its time in 1921. Tellurian's put on trial, but interestingly enough, at his trial, the judges listened to Tellurian's testimony, and they're so moved by what he went through that the judges basically find him innocent on the grounds of what today we'd call temporary insanity. They recognize someone who goes through something like that, we understand why they would seek someone down and try to bring this justice. But we're interested in this story because of the influence it has on a young man by the name of Raphael Lemkin, who's a Polish Jew who's 21 years of age, 1921, the age of many of you in this room. Raphael Lemkin is studying at the University of Lvov. He's a linguist. He's studying law here at the university. And he goes to his professor because he's so caught, as everyone is in Europe, by the trial of Tellurian. He goes to his professor to try and get his mind around it. And here's Lemkin's simple but important question. Lemkin says, I understand it's a crime for one man to kill another man, and he should be held responsible. Tellurian ought to be held responsible for committing the crime of murder. But, Lemkin says, the man he killed over 1 million people. He was responsible for the death of over 1 million people, and there's no law against that. How can that not be a crime? And in Lemkin's journals, which I've had the chance to work with on many occasions, Lemkin has this beautiful sentence where he says, this is most inconsistent. One man kills another man, it's a crime. The man he killed over 1 million people. There's no law against that. This is most inconsistent. And his professor says to Lemkin, Raphael, you have to understand the concept of what we call state sovereignty. And he draws this unfortunate analogy where he says to Lemkin, think of a farmer who has a flock of chickens. And one day, the farmer decides to kill his chickens. And as he's doing so, you're walking by on the street, you see him killing his chickens, and you step over the fence to stop the killing. Who's committed the crime? You have. The person who stepped over the fence. You've trespassed. And he says, Raphael, a farmer can do what he wants to do to his own chickens. And his professor was basically saying, a state can do what it wants to do to its own citizens. If Turkey had crossed an international border and committed genocide, they've committed an act of war, and they would be held responsible for that. But Lemkin's professor says when a state stays within its own bounds, it can do whatever it wants to its own chickens. It can do whatever it wants to its own civilians. That's the concept of state sovereignty. It's something we still struggle with today when we ask questions of why don't we do something in Syria, in Iraq, in Central African Republic, in Burma, in South Sudan. State sovereignty is a big part of the answer for the world staying on the sideline, because we still feel as if no one wants to violate a country's state sovereignty. But Lemkin's point was to say sometimes a country is so irresponsible when it's killing its own civilians, the world has to violate state sovereignty. We have to step in and make a difference. So for Lemkin, this really focused his attention on trying to develop this word, genocide. Lemkin recognized that what he was calling at this time race murder, we needed to have law against it. He tried the League of Nations. He didn't actually attend, but he had a proposal presented. But he hears this speech from Winston Churchill in 1941. Churchill's just come back from a meeting in the Atlantic with Franklin Roosevelt, and Churchill says in this speech, describing the Holocaust, what we call the Holocaust, he says, we're in the presence of a crime without a name. And Lemkin was a linguist. By the age of 14, he was fluent in 10 different languages. Pretty incredible. And he thought, if I give the crime a name, then maybe the world will do something about it. And the name of the crime that Lemkin came up with was genocide. The Greek genos, meaning race or tribe. The Latin side that we know from homicide, fratricide, and so on. And this is the coining of the term in 1944. Many people are surprised because today, genocide is such a modern part of our vocabulary, a consistent, ubiquitous part of our modern vocabulary. People are surprised to realize that the word didn't exist before 1944. But for Lemkin, he thought, if we give the word a name, if the crime has a name, then maybe we can make legislation against it. And that's what he attempted to do with the help of others at the United Nations. Now for Lemkin, this had also become a very personal pursuit. He was a Polish Jew. He had fled Poland after he was part of the resistance. He had taken a position at Duke, State Department of the US, but he lost 49 family members. And for Lemkin, he lost pretty much everyone close to him in the Holocaust. When Lemkin dies in 1959, if you look at the New York Times obituary, and don't just look at his, but look at all the obits from that particular day, every obituary ends with a rich listing of he or she was married to so-and-so, they had these children, they're survived by these aunts and uncles and nieces and nephews and sometimes parents. And you look at Lemkin's obit, and it ends with a final sentence, he was a bachelor. Was all he had. I mean, he had no other people. 7 people attended his funeral because he had lost so much in the Holocaust. So it really does for him become a personal crusade. Eventually, what the United Nations passes in terms of a definition of genocide is this, and I know this is far too much for you to write down, but you can easily find it online in any number of places, but this is Article 2 of 19 Articles of the Convention. And today, when you ask people in law or in the academic field, is so-and-so genocide, this is typically the definition we refer back to. In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. So the first question we ask is the group that's being persecuted one of the 4 protected groups of the Genocide Convention? And this is where a lot of the debate falls, because the convention only protects 4 groups. The group that's most often the victim of mass violence is political groups. It's not one of the 4 protected groups by the convention. If it is one of the 4 protected groups, are they being destroyed in one of these 5 ways? They don't have to be being destroyed in all 5, 3 of 5, 2 of 5, just 1 of 5. So this is kind of the litmus test that international law begins to build around in terms of defining what genocide is. Now, in truth, international law has added a lot to this definition, but this is still the definition today that the United Nations works from. Every year, 4 times a year, I teach a seminar at Auschwitz on the grounds of Auschwitz I, the former concentration camp. And it's to either officials or military personnel. And our teaching partner for that week-long seminar is the United Nations. And this is always one of the tricky parts of the week, is when the UN talks about genocide, this is what they restrict themselves to. When the rest of us talk about genocide, we have a much broader definition of protected groups, much broader definition even of destruction, but unfortunately it's not something the UN at this point has responded to. Third question, what are the costs of genocide? I think here, just to give you an idea, the 20th century was certainly not the century where genocide was invented, but in the 20th century, we got very good, in a morally inverted sense of the word, at committing genocide and mass atrocity. When I say mass atrocity, I'm including here, with the crime of genocide, crimes of war crimes and crimes against humanity. So some of the cases here you'll see, just for illustration, are clearly cases of genocide. Some of them are probably better labeled war crimes, crimes against humanity, but once you get a sense of the scope of what we saw in the last century, physical and cultural destruction of Native American populations in Canada, in the US, in Australia, destruction of a native Southwest African population in 1904, the Armenian genocide we've spoken a bit about, the implementation of Soviet man-made famine in the Ukraine, the Holocaust of 1939 to 45, which after was so devastating. 6 million Jews, 2 out of every 3 of Europe's Jews die in the Holocaust, that at the liberation of Buchenwald, you see a prisoner holding up a sign that, written in Russian, says, "Never again." And that phrase is something we picked up on. How many of you have visited the U.S. Holocaust Museum in D.C.? A few people? If you're there, you go in the gift shop, you can find any number of things with the phrase "never again" written on it. And again, we want to live in a world where never again is the reality. But one journalist says, really, never again only has meaning if by it you mean never again would Germans kill Jews in Europe in the 1940s. If that's what never again means, then you're spot on. But if by it you mean never again would we see something like the Holocaust, really it's better phrased ever again. Since the Holocaust, we've seen genocide and mass atrocities in countries as wide-ranging as Indonesia, Bangladesh, Burundi, Cambodia, East Timor, Argentina, Guatemala, Sri Lanka, Iraq, Rwanda, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Nepal, Darfur. I mean, really, just across the breadth of our globe, we've seen people falling victim to their own government as victims of mass atrocities. What are the costs of this? I think there are different ways we can talk about cost. The human cost, in terms of life lost, is about 60 million, and that's a conservative estimate. Lives lost to genocide, 20th century. Sometimes you'll hear people say genocide is the most pressing human rights problem we have in the world today. And unfortunately, you can kind of quantify that. I mean, what other human rights problems have taken 60 million lives in one century? So the people drawn to genocide studies and genocide prevention are drawn to it because, in a sense, the enormity of the problem, just the loss of human life there, is incredible. And the generational impacts of what that means. Again, I have a friend who's a rabbi who, like Lemkin, lost everyone close to him in the Holocaust. It's just he and his wife now. He says the hardest days for him are special days in the American calendar, like a Mother's Day, or even people's birthdays. He'll go out to a restaurant and he'll see a party of 25 people celebrating something. And he sees that party and he looks at he and his wife, and as much as he loves his wife and as much as she loves him, it's just the two of them. There's no party of 25 family members they can pull together, because 50 years later, they still feel the presence of the absence caused by the loss of all of their families in the Holocaust. So this human cost is a loss in terms of lives lost, but it's also a loss in terms of the generational impacts of what's left behind. There's cultural costs, I think, to genocide. This picture here, it's a little hard to see in the top of the three pictures, is a picture of the National Library in Sarajevo. I was in Sarajevo this past June for the 100th commemoration of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, an event that was one of many events that triggered World War I. This library had been destroyed in 1992, at the start of the Yugoslav wars, and the Serbs destroyed it very intentionally because it was a library that held some of the most precious cultural pieces of what it meant to be Yugoslavian, of the region's history. And the Serbs sat in the mountainsides around Sarajevo, and they first threw in bombs that would destroy the ceiling of the library, mostly a glass ceiling, so fairly easy to destroy. And then they launched in incendiary devices that would land in the library and burn it down, because they knew what was there in terms of culture. And the loss that Sarajevans and Yugoslavians experienced because of what was lost in the National Library, that's a cultural loss. It's a cultural destruction. And when I was there, they just finally happened to open it again for the first time since the war, and they had the Viennese symphony play the night that the National Library was reopened again. And it was a wonderful time of celebration and also a painful time of mourning because of so much that was lost. You think of indigenous peoples in the US and Canada and Australia, and you think of the cultural costs of taking from people a language, a religion, a tradition, a heritage, a style of life, And you start to realize, and this was, I think, Lemkin's great insight, which sometimes is lost. Lemkin realized there are a lot of ways to destroy a people. I don't have to kill you to destroy you. I can destroy you in different ways. And cultural destruction is part of that. And then finally, we have the development economic cost. It's estimated that following an event as calamitous as genocide, that a country can lose 30 years of economic growth, that it can take about 20 years for a country's foreign trade to rebound and redevelop. So again, when you visit post-conflict societies like in Argentina, Guatemala, Rwanda, Bosnia-Herzegovina, you're struck by the fact of how the effects of genocide go so far beyond the killing that the cost of it in terms of culture and development and economy are pretty staggering. Our fourth question is, what are the areas that we're currently worried about at risk for genocide? I'd love to be able to be here with you tonight and say, you know, you should study genocide because it's historical reality. We don't have to worry about it today, but history you need to understand so we don't repeat it. Unfortunately, we do worry about it today. We live in a world where we have close to 20 countries that we could say by various measures are at risk for genocide as we sit here tonight. We live in a world where I think you could make an argument that 5 countries, as we sit here tonight, probably have genocide ongoing in some form or the other right now. Again, the seminars we teach at Auschwitz, we teach because we recognize that government officials, military personnel are the people on the front lines of these events, and they need to understand what genocide is and what the warning signs are. So what are we concerned about in the world today? Here's a forecasting model from the Atrocity Forecasting Project. There are a lot of different models that are used. This one's based in Sydney, Australia. But you see here a list of countries that they suggest are at risk for genocide, or what scholars call politicide, which means genocide aimed at a political group. And their model actually forecast out from 2011 to 2015, and you look at the wide range of countries here that they consider at risk of genocide. We look at some of these countries today, and you could make a case that we see the beginning stages of genocide in Syria. You can make the case that we certainly see it in Central African Republic. You could make the case for a country that's not on here, South Sudan, that we see it, the world's newest country, 194th country. You can make the case that we see it in Myanmar. So, you know, these are estimates of where are the places in the world that the wood is stacked. And all we're waiting for is a match. But the wood is stacked because everything's in place. We've got a polarizing ruling elite. We've got a disenfranchised minority. We've got economic issues. We've got poverty. We've got a fragile transitional political state. All the risk factors we look at, we put those into play, and we've got a lot of countries in the world that we're worried about. So unfortunately, when you work in genocide studies, you're not working in a field that's going away anytime soon. And you add to that so many of these hostilities have to do with identity. And the key identity issue driving conflict today is religion. This is a Pew Research report from January 2014 about social hostilities around the world. And at the bottom you see the color coordinates for levels of social hostilities involving religion. And again, look at the areas of the world, the darker colors, where we've got significant social hostility involving an identity, religion, that in most cases is supposed to be inclusive, supposed to be tolerant, supposed to be empathic. But here, as you look at this map, it's used in the opposite direction. Religion is divisive, it's exclusionary, it's filled with hatred and hate-filled ideology, and it's exterminatory in some cases. People exterminating groups of other people on the basis of religion. So these identity-fueled conflicts are the things that concern us greatly, because identity is about who we are and who we perceive ourselves to be, but it's also about who we're not. And sometimes who we're not is so threatening to us that we think maybe the only way we can deal with who we're not is to get rid of them, to be rid of them. if you were to ask me, and I try to be a pretty optimistic guy generally, but if you were to ask me what's the future of these conflicts in the world in which we live, I think we have some things to be concerned about. I think one, we recognize we have a lot more countries and borders today than we've ever had in history. In the 1870s, we had 47 countries. At the end of World War II, we only had 60 countries. Today, we've got 196 or 194 countries, depending on your count. You're going to think me older than I want you to think me, but it's true. When I was in grade school and middle school, we had so few countries in the world that one of our memorization assignments was to memorize the list of countries and their presidents. And it was doable, because we're only looking at 70-some at that time in history. It was hard, but it was doable. You couldn't do that today. Almost 200 countries in the world today. That's a lot more borders that surround territories, a lot more borders to be contested, and we may even increase this number. I mean, we look at the former Yugoslavia, and there's some thought there that partitioning parts of that region into even smaller countries might be the next step. Some people suggest it's the next step for the Middle East. So with this proliferation of states, it does act as a conflict multiplier. Another big conflict multiplier is population growth. It doesn't technically meet the definition of exponential, but it's close, it's drastic. Here you see that until the 1800s, the world's population grew pretty slowly, but now the global rate of population growth is 1 billion every 15 years. This is what this looks like graphically, I think. Oops, I think we went too quick. Okay, here's what we look like graphically in terms of population growth. You just kind of see just the steady increase and steady climb. It's not so much that it's greater numbers of people that's a problem, but it's the demand that greater numbers of people put on fairly scarce resources. And again, what's most unfortunate is this population growth is not evenly distributed across the world. So it hits countries that are already at risk because of other risk factors, also become increasingly at risk because of pretty drastic population growth. We add to these two risk factors we've talked about a third one, of fragile, unstable, failed, or failing states. We have statehood is not an easy thing to pull off. Some of you are on athletic teams where cohesion on an athletic team is not easy to pull off. Some of you are in dorms, where in the dorm you think, I don't know if this group of people can live together. Imagine trying to pull off statehood, what it means to be a nation, what it means to be a state. And we live in a world where we have an increasing number of states that are variously called fragile, unstable, failed, or failing. I think the most discouraging thing for me over the past few years has been the world's newest nation, South Sudan. The group I work with the Auschwitz Institute, we've put a ton of effort into genocide prevention training in South Sudan. We've brought half a dozen South Sudanese government officials to Auschwitz for trainings. I've been to South Sudan on two different occasions to train their national office on genocide and mass atrocity prevention. So you understand our discouragement last December when episodes of mass violence broke out in South Sudan. When some cases it looked close to be coming, what we define as genocidal happened in South Sudan. When we lost contact with the very people we had trained and didn't know if we lost contact because they had been killed or if they were doing the killing. I mean, we're just unsure what was happening. But it's heartbreaking to think of all the world has put into the birth of South Sudan. And to see South Sudan today as closer to becoming a failed state than a successful state. Here's a map of the fragile states. And again, you kind of see the same little pattern of states in the darker colors that by this 2004 index are fragile and at risk today. And then the final thing we can say as a conflict multiplier would be the reality of climate change. This has actually been, in the research, we've been talking about the impact of climate change on conflict for quite some time. Most of us tend to think of people who live on the seaside, on the coast, as wealthy people. In truth, throughout the world, the highest number of the refugee populations in the world live on the coast. As sea levels increase, those people are pushed inwards into lands where they're already populated by other people, and we just have these increasing pressure for resources. So I was a little surprised and kind of encouraged that this last Friday, the U.S. National Intelligence Strategy was released, and this is a report that's done about every 5 years by the CIA, and in it they assess the risk to the world and the U.S. What are the most pressing global risks? And for the first time in the U.S. National Intelligence Strategy, we've included climate change, because it leads to things like the scarcity of water, food, and energy that conflicts will be fought over. And for the first time, our government is recognizing they actually put it on par with proliferations of weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, and scarcity of resources due to climate change. Those are equal threats in the eyes of our national intelligence strategy. In Africa right now, the most conflict-ridden continent in the world, about 7 out of 10 conflicts are over the scarcity of water. Something that I look around here tonight, many of you have, and you have easy access to, isn't as easy to access, and is a driver for conflict in many parts of Africa. So fifth and finally, and then we'll have time for questions from you, what can you do to make a difference? I'm going to suggest 5 things that I think can be helpful for us as we think about how do we make a difference in a world that's hurting, okay? Again, if you've sat here tonight and you've kind of listened to some of the stories of suffering and some of the reality of genocide, and you can still say, what does that have to do with me? It's not a big deal to me. You're probably not at a point where you want to make a difference. But most of you here probably heard enough, even before tonight, to say, I know I live in a world where people don't have the same opportunities I have. I know I live in a world where some people live in fear of their own lives. What are the things I can do to make a difference? And I do think there are things you can do to make a difference. For me, what always keeps my spirits up about the work we do in the field is that I firmly believe genocide is a human-made problem. If it's a human-made problem, it has a human-made solution. This problem didn't come from outside. It's not an extraterrestrial problem. It's not something satanic or demonic. It's humans killing other humans in large numbers over an extended period of time. So if we've made the problem, I firmly believe we can be part of the solution. And a few things we can look at here. One would be just the push for, and I think in Holy Cross you probably understand this better than some other schools, the need for some level of personal activism. Theodore Parker was a Unitarian minister in Boston who wrote this: I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure it bends toward justice. The famous 20th century American figure who used a paraphrase of this quote more than any other quote in his speeches and writings. Do you know who it would be? Yes. It was Martin Luther King Jr., exactly right. King, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Now, he never used this quote the same way 2 times. It was always different in speeches or writings, but it's clear it was King's favorite quote. But what I love is 3 years ago, on Martin Luther King Day, President Obama, in speaking about the day, pulled this quote out. And he used it in an important way, because sometimes I think people see this quote and they think the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends toward justice on its own. And if you just let it go, it'll get there. You don't need to be part of it. But President Obama pointed out the truth of how King always used the statement and how Parker used the statement. It was always in the context of, you have to help bend the arc of the moral universe. It won't do it on its own. It does it if you will it that direction. It does it if you push it that direction. So I love this quote from King, my favorite King quote. And I'm from Atlanta, so my life is kind of filled with King quotes. But this is the favorite one because it reminds me that we can push this universe toward moral justice, but we have to be part of that push. It's not just going to happen on its own. So what are some of the things that are parts of that push? I think one thing I'd suggest in terms of what you can do is to keep your consciences soft and vulnerable. Every time I use that phrase, I don't know if I'd like it. It doesn't sound like I want it to sound, but what I'm simply trying to say is just feel the suffering of people around you. Have a conscience about the suffering of people in your community. That means here at Holy Cross, it means in Worcester, it means in the U.S., it means in the Central African Republic. Know other people's stories, and don't be afraid to let those stories touch you. I have a friend at Auschwitz who's fond of saying, she works at the museum, my cut finger hurts more than your broken leg. And she's saying the truth about human nature. The small things that affect me are more important to me than the huge things that affect you. We've got to change that calculus a little bit if we want to have a community, a global community, to where we can say, my conscience is soft enough, it's vulnerable enough that I care for the suffering of someone else. Sometimes I can do something to help alleviate that suffering. Sometimes I can't do much beyond care for it, but we'd much rather be caring for it than to be immune to it in some way. I think secondly, we can join and support movements and organizations that already exist that do a lot of this work. There are tons, and if you want to see me after, I can share them with you. If you want to email me, Dr. Anderson is my email address. You can easily find it on the Keene.edu website. We have a lot of good people, and again, it's what I love about working in this field. I get to work with some of the best people in the world, people who have soft and vulnerable consciences, people who want to make a difference, people who recognize that someone else's suffering is also part of their suffering and their story. So you don't have to start something from scratch. You could. You could start a genocide awareness club here on campus, and you could start something from scratch. But there are organizations already in place committed to this work who, if they were here tonight and you asked them, what do you need more than anything else? You might expect them to say money. Most of them will say you. They need you more than anything else. They need volunteers. They need people. They need people who are willing to make a difference. So we have those groups out there that you can be part of. Thirdly, sorry, just a little quick on the trigger with this guy. Well, we'll stay here a second. You can keep informed and inform others through social networks and social media. You know more about this than I do, okay? I don't know. I have a phone with me here somewhere tonight, but I never know where it's at. My kids always call me, and I don't know where it's at. I just don't keep up with it. Most all of you probably came here tonight with a phone. You have social networks, you have social media that I'm incredibly envious of, the ways you're networked to other people in your life. Social contagion theory is a psychological theory that says for most of us, if you look at the number of people in our life that care about something we say, they may not agree with us, but they'll listen to us because they care about us in some way. Most of us have about 1,000 people in that circle of influence. You may not think you have that many, but start to think of your family and your friends and teachers you've had in grade school, middle school, high school, teachers you've had here. You probably pretty easily have 1,000 people who will listen to something you say simply because you're saying it. You are connected in ways through social media that we never dreamed possible when I was your age in college. We never thought it would be possible to be connected in ways you are. Social media can be great fun. I mean, we can always, you can never get enough of cats playing piano, right? That's a great use of social media. But social media can be an important influence as well. There's some great things we can do with social media if we put our minds to it. In Kenya, we were pretty active in the recent 2013 elections because there had been substantial violence in the previous elections in 2008 that almost became genocidal. So there were several groups in Kenya working to use what Kenyans had, which is cell phones. I mean, most people, we actually have more cell phones in the world today than we have people. So sometimes you think of less developed countries and you think they don't have cell phone technology. They actually do. Most people in Africa do have access to a cell phone or know someone who has a cell phone. They don't have the same plans you and I do. They're pay per minute or something, but they have access to the technology. And in Kenya, we taught people what to do with their phones. Send an alert when you see violence in your neighborhood, at an election place or somewhere else. Let's let someone know. That someone will alert a wider network, and let's keep an eye on violence when it starts. Let's not wait to read about it the next day or next month when the government reports are in. Let's monitor it with the things people have right now. The most powerful tool they have, their cell phone. And it made a huge difference in Kenya. So there are wonderful things you can do with that use of social media. You see here that we live in a time of what researchers call big data. More data created in 2011 than all of human history. 400 million tweets per day. Now, some of you are sitting here thinking, yeah, I do most of those. Maybe you do. But actually, Jakarta is the most tweetingest city in the world. Jakarta, we got a Jakarta rep. Jakarta has a lot of traffic. People send a lot of tweets out about traffic in Jakarta. Blogs, developing world, access to mobile technology. I mean, this is just too powerful for us to ignore as a tool for positive social change. It's a ton of fun, ton of great things we can do with it, but it connects us with the pulse of the globe. This is what, when we're working in Kenya, this is what we emphasize to Kenyans who were saying to us, I didn't finish school. I can't do anything. And we're saying to Kenyans, you are, because of what you have in your hand, a cell phone, you're an intelligence sensor. You're an intelligence gatherer. You're the most important thing we've got going in this election is you being able to tell us what's going on exactly when it's going on. Fourthly, we can shape political will by lobbying elected officials. Dr. Anderton has his PowerPoint. If any of you want a copy of it from him, you can certainly get it. But you know, and it's easy to get access now to who your elected officials are, you can shape political will. You can make law. This is my all-time favorite story. 2 years ago, Keene State, I was teaching a genocide course, probably about 50 students in it. And I think I was going through this bit about what you can do to make a difference, and I was wondering if they were listening, or they falling asleep, or whatever. And one of the things I said is that at that point, there were 3 states in the U.S., Texas, Minnesota, blanking on the third one, that had made state legislation making April State Genocide Awareness and Prevention Month. So the month of April, the state would hold ceremonies about genocide prevention and awareness. Teachers in the state would focus their parts of their curriculum on genocide prevention and awareness. And I said something like, wouldn't it be cool if we could make our state, New Hampshire, the 4th one? I had 2 young female students in the class, ironically, neither of them from New Hampshire, who listened to that and thought, yeah, that'd be really cool to have New Hampshire become the 4th state to make April Genocide Prevention and Awareness Month. And 2 weeks ago today, I sat in a classroom at Keene State College with our president, our provost, our deans, the governor of New Hampshire, a couple state senators, and there in our classroom with those 2 students sitting beside her, Governor Maggie Hassan signed into law Genocide Awareness and Prevention Month for the month of April, beginning April 2015 in New Hampshire and continuing for every year thereafter. What I loved about that is I loved the faces on those 2 students, because they sat there and they thought, we made law. They did make law. I mean, they didn't just influence. They didn't influence by pushing buttons and saying to their politician, you've got to care about this, you got to do something about it. They actually made the law. They got it through the legislature. They collected the testimony. They did the work. And what I love about that is just the recognition. In a country where sometimes politics seems very far away from us, there's nothing we can do to make a difference. I've got 2 students now in their senior year at Keene State who made law in New Hampshire that will be there year after year after year and make a difference. And then finally, contacting local newspapers, television, radio. As you hear about things in your classes, parts of the world today that are self-destructing, where genocide's happening, war crimes, crimes against humanity, Think about what your television news shows show you. Think about what your campus newspaper writes about. Think about what you hear about on the radio and social media. Again, use those forces for social good. In Keene, our newspaper has a policy, letters to the editor. It will publish every letter they receive, as long as it's not full of obscenities. It will publish it. Maybe not in the paper, but online. So it's great for our students and our community to voice and write and say, in addition to all the things we're concerned about as a community, here's something we're concerned about as a global community. So finally, I'll finish with this and then take any questions you might have. This for me is one of my favorite quotes. It comes from Arthur Ashe. Many of you know of Arthur Ashe. He was an African-American male tennis player, the first African-American to win the U.S. Open. He was also an activist in the fight against AIDS. He contracted AIDS as a result of blood transfusion in a hospital in Richmond, Virginia. He eventually died because of the complications of that disease. When Ashe was asked, and he'd be asked often by audiences, what can we do about AIDS? What can we do about racism, about civil rights, about apartheid? Ashe had this beautiful phrase, and I just love the simplicity and the directness of it. You start where you are, you use what you have, you do what you can. In other words, none of you are excused from doing something. You don't wait until you become a professor, you don't wait until you become a lawyer, you don't wait until you become a teacher, you don't wait until you get into the business world, you don't wait until you become a coach or whatever it is you want to do. You don't wait until you think you have the position to do something. What Ashe says here is beautifully powerful. You start where you are. Don't worry about learning another language right now. Don't worry about finishing college right now. Start where you are. You use what you have, and you do what you can. That's going to vary. Some of you have more than others. Some of you will do more than others. It's not the important part. The important part is if everyone in this room starts where they are, they use what they have, they do what they can, on any social problem, you're going to make a huge difference. Too many of us sit on the sidelines, and this is what Ashe always said. Too many people sit back and wait for others to do it, or they wait until they're the right point in life to do it. The right point in life is now. You start where you are, you use what you have, and you have things I don't have access to. You know people I don't know. You have connections I don't have. Use those things and do whatever you can to make a difference. If it's just leaving here and talking to someone in your dorm about something that was said here tonight or you heard someone else say tonight that struck you, that saddened you, that fascinated you, if it's something you read about because of time you've been here, just start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. And I absolutely believe that we can unmake this problem that we've made, the problem of genocide. We can unmake it. We can be part of the solution if we choose to. I want to take about 10 or 15 minutes for questions or comments you have. Oh, okay, maybe it's just me. So I'm hot in here, but questions or comments you have, why don't we talk for a few minutes, things you want to ask, say. Don't let the microphone intimidate you, but if you don't come here, other people in the room won't be able to hear you. So it'd be great if you could just make your way to the microphone. Or you could just say it from your seat and I could repeat it if that's easier for you. Yes?
Earlier you spoke about state sovereignty, and with recent history, Darfur, Rwanda, Syria right now, the CAR right now, the UN has consistently proven unwilling to violate that concept of state sovereignty. Do you think that states have a responsibility to act independently to prevent genocide and stop it while it's occurring? Or do you think that the only way to stop genocide is to do what you've been doing, going around speaking to nations like South Sudan, trying to build that resistance from within?
That's a great question. I hope most of you heard the question. The question was about state sovereignty, and the United Nations is very unwilling to violate state sovereignty, so genocide just goes on until it pretty well stops because the victim group is completely suppressed and we don't do enough to stop it, so how do we get over it? It's a great question. Let me give you several responses. One is, I work often, as I said, with the UN. Some of the best people I know work with the United Nations. They're great people. But often when we criticize, and you weren't doing this, but I think when we criticize the UN, we forget that the UN is not an independent autonomous organization. The UN is a collection of 192, 193 member states. So when we say the UN doesn't do something, we're really saying the member states of the UN don't want to do it. And no country wants to have its sovereignty violated. Because the thought is, if we violate a country's sovereignty because they're killing their civilians, does that open the door enough that we begin to violate their sovereignty in other ways? So usually a classic example is, maybe we could agree that we go into a country because it's committing genocide, and rather than unilaterally, which none of us want to do as countries, the United Nations goes in and tries to intervene to stop the genocide. Well, if that happens, what if you have another country that practices female genital mutilation? Human rights abuse, by most people's definition. Whether it's a religious or cultural practice, a human rights abuse of a woman's body against her will. Is that important enough to violate state sovereignty? We've already done it for genocide. So we've said we can violate it sometimes. Is that important enough? Is it important enough to violate state sovereignty if something else happens and something else happens? So we don't violate it easily because we worry about what it means in the long run. Especially countries in the world that can't stand up to the development of the U.S. They don't want us violating their state sovereignty because they feel like we probably already do it in a lot of ways anyway. So the question becomes, and this is what the world has wrestled with over the past decade, is a concept called the responsibility to protect. And what the UN and its member states have signed on to is this R2P, responsibility to protect, that says state sovereignty is a state's privilege. But if the state abuses the privilege by killing its own civilians, the state forfeits state sovereignty, and the world has a responsibility to intervene. So we've made state sovereignty conditional. We've said, you have state sovereignty as long as you use it responsibly. But if you kill your own people, that's not state sovereignty. You can't be protected. You're not going to hide behind it. I love the concept of R2P. The tricky point right now is the world really ready to apply it? So when we see something happening like we do in South Sudan, or Kar or Burma, where a government is killing its own people, they forfeit state sovereignty, but we still don't know what does it mean for the world to step in. Is that always militarily? Does it always have to be US-led? Should the United Nations have a standing rapid response force, which they don't? So even if the UN decides to intervene, it's going to take a couple of months to pull together troops from member states to do it, to train them, to get them on the ground, to supply. You measure that in the loss of thousands of lives. In Rwanda, 800,000 people died in 100 days. Auschwitz, its highest functioning, never killed that many people. 800,000 people in 100 days, that's a frenzy of killing. So if we delay getting help to a country like that, you measure that in the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives. So this is what we all still struggle with, I think, at the UN level, is we can agree that state sovereignty is not something you can hide behind to kill your own people. What's difficult is, when do we choose to go in? So the work I try to be involved in with the Auschwitz Institute is we want to prevent this before it gets to that point. We want to build strong, stable, solid states that make genocide less likely, because once it starts, the world is so unsure about how to respond to it in many cases, or if it should respond to it, that people are just dying by the hundreds of thousands. So we want to build early preventive things, and I think that's what the UN is trying to do in building state capacity, which I appreciate. It's a great question. Other question? Yes.
How many countries have you been to doing your work?
How many countries have I been to? God, I think I came prepared for that question. I don't know. That's a great question. I can say, resonate with some of you. When I sat as a college student where you're sitting, I was a first-generation college student and had never been out of the U.S. I'd never been out of the South. I went to school in Kentucky. That's the farthest out of the South I'd ever been. And I thought that was a different world. In Kentucky, like cousins married cousins. I'd never seen anything like that. Didn't know what was happening. But that was the farthest I'd ever been. I didn't take my first international trip abroad till after I had my PhD. I went to Berlin to teach for 2 years. And that international travel for me was life-changing. So I was 25, 26 before I ever traveled abroad. If you'd asked me when I was sitting where you are what I would do, I was a PE major. I was going to be a coach. I was going to coach basketball. It's what I had done and been interested in. It's what I thought I would do for my life. And I stayed open to other things, but I would never see myself being here tonight talking to you about this topic. Just never part of how I envisioned it. But international travel kind of stimulated that interest for me, and I followed that passion. And now, yeah, I do travel enough that I don't enjoy it as much as I used to, because I just like being at home. But I love the countries in Europe, and most recently it's been Latin America, Argentina, Guatemala, Colombia, Chile, and a lot of countries in Africa as well. So, I mean, it's been great opportunities that I didn't see coming, but it's done for me what I said at the beginning tonight. It's kind of taught me to know other people's stories. And I'm always I'm just a listener. When I go places, I very seldom do the talking with people. I just love listening to their stories. And I think that has shaped me as a person more than anything else. More than travel, it's just been able to be listening to people when you travel.
I don't know if this is just my experience, but you said that one of the ways that we can help stop genocide is having a soft and vulnerable conscience.
Mm-hmm.
Today and age, I feel a lot of things that I see on social media and whatnot. Everybody likes this philosophy of like a rugged individualism, kind of like achieving the American dream, kind of like do it yourself, pull yourself by your own bootstraps, and just doing it all on your own. Do you think that this philosophy, and it seems like widespread for me in America right now, people doing this rugged individual thing, do you think that philosophy gets in the way of having that conscience? And if so, how do we fight against that, especially with like youth in America today who believe in that?
That's a great question. If you didn't hear his question, it's about the individual that has made up so much of American history, and in many ways has been a great part of how we've come to be who we are today. Is that kind of at odds with feeling someone else's pain and knowing someone else's story and suffering? And I certainly think it can be. And I think we've seen that very close to home just in discussions of race relations in America. That's been part of the underlying dialogue about that has been, well, I made it. If I made it, someone else should be able to make it without affirmative action, without public assistance, without extra help in terms of college tuition, scholarships, and so on. And I think I think you're onto something in that in our country there is a spirit in which we should be able to do these things individually, and that our story does matter more than other people's stories, and that our stories, especially when they're stories of success and rugged individualism, are really what everyone should aspire to. And I think the challenge for us is, and maybe I don't know Holy Cross well enough to know if you have these challenges on your campus, but I suspect you do, is how do you bring together a community of 2,800 people here? Different agendas, different pasts, different futures, different presents. Is there some common thread that can weave a community together? Is there a climate in which people can listen to the other and see with the other's eyes? Those are difficult things to practice. We can make nice slogans about them, but I do think they're the heart of what we mean by community. But when we become afraid, and I think when we kind of live in that fear, I think that's when we start to focus. I think pain makes us all very narcissistic, and fear makes us narcissistic. When we're afraid, when we're in pain, then it's just our story that we want to hear, and it's just our story that we want to privilege. And I think those things make those community ties kind of difficult. And I'll close with this story. In Rwanda, which is now 20 years since its genocide, it's dealing with a lot of these questions of history and narrative and story and memory, and how you pull those things back together to go forward as a society. And I think Rwanda can be criticized in some ways for what some people would call human rights abuses or limits of freedom of speech as it goes forward, but in some other ways it's made pretty incredible, remarkable progress. And every time I'm in Rwanda, the first time I was there, 5 years after the genocide, and I asked someone who had been there during the genocide and survived the genocide, we were talking about the effect it had on children. And he said, and I think it's a pretty fair estimate, that 95% of children in Rwanda saw someone killed in the genocide. They didn't read about it, they didn't hear about it, they didn't watch it on television. In front of their eyes, they saw someone killed. For most of them, who they saw killed was a family member, probably a mother and father. For most of them, the person they saw killed was hacked to death, probably with a machete, probably a dull machete, 20, 25, 30 hacks to kill someone. This is what 95% of your children grew up having witnessed. So this is a generation of trauma. So for Rwanda, the challenge has been, how do you build something new out of a generation that's been through that? Out of children that have seen that type of atrocity, how do you build something new? And again, for all the ways you can criticize Rwanda, they're finding ways forward as a country. And I always think when I'm there, if they can rebuild out of what they were, we can find ways to rebuild out of what we've been as a country. We can find ways to rebuild globally. Again, I'll go back to where we started, the resilience of what I see in Rwanda. I'm just reminded, we can find ways to go forward with this. We can find ways to make this world a better place. And I'm always struck by just the humanness of the people who are doing this work. And again, if you leave here tonight and that's the only thing you remember, I want you to think about what are the ways, now that you're aware about genocide, what are some of the ways that you can make a difference in a world that's hurting? And I want you to think about your world as very close to you here and very far away as well, because you don't have to travel to make that difference. What are the ways that you can make a difference there? It has been great to come here tonight and see so many people willing to take so much time out of their evening to be here. I know for many of you there's a kickoff to a football game that begins in 7 minutes, so I want to be sensitive to that. That's an important part of what you do. So enjoy the night. Chuck, anything else we need to say?
Let's give Jim a